Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Minds 6. I'm your host, Ruby, and today we're going to be getting back into Creepers, the Scarecrow by Edgar J. Hyde. Where we last left off was Chapter 7, The Banker. Before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It would mean a great deal to me if you did. And without further ado, my dear friends, grab a snack, grab a drink, or sit back and relax, and let's get to it. Chapter 7, The Banker. David woke up very tired the next morning. He had hardly slept at all that night. After he had seen the Scarecrow back in his usual position, David had been unable to tell his dad any more about his theory about what their farm scarecrow was up to. Sarah and he had gone to his room and talked for hours trying to make some sense of it all. Even after his mom had sent them to bed, Sarah had come back in to continue their conversation. As he climbed out of bed, David wondered for a second if it had all been a dream. He wished it were all a dream. He pulled the window curtain back and looked at the figure in the field. Who are you, and what are you? David thought, the sense of fear beginning to rise in him again. The brief hours of sleep that he had managed to get had been a welcome break from the constant feeling of fear in his head and stomach that had been with him the previous day. As he headed for the bathroom, Sarah was coming up the stairs. His sister's worried face confirmed that it had been no dream. They were living in a nightmare. David knew he had to convince his dad. He had decided he would try again that evening. He would write it all down during the day while he was at school, getting it all clear in his own mind, and try to convince him that they had witnessed the Scarecrow there one minute, gone the next, only to reappear again. Scarecrows aren't supposed to do that. At least Sarah had been there. She had witnessed the Scarecrow's vanishing act. They had agreed not to mention anything until they got home from school later. They would then sit their dad down in the living room and explain it all. David got dressed slowly. As he came down the stairs, he could hear his parents' voices clearly in the kitchen. Sarah and Emma were still in their rooms, so his mom and dad were alone in the kitchen. David hesitated as their voices were becoming louder. They were arguing. They rarely argued. Mr. Davies usually went out of his way to make sure his wife was happy, and she did the same for him. David wondered what the problem was. He silently continued down the stairs before stopping on the bottom step to listen. But this is serious this time, John, Mrs. Davies said anxiously. What are we gonna do? Listen, Karen, don't worry. We have had money problems before, and we have always come through. We'll figure this one out too, replied Mr. Davies, trying to calm his wife. Yes, but how? How do we find the money this time? You said you had been to all the banks, and they couldn't help us. What's left to do? We're gonna lose it all, Mrs. Davies continued. David could sense his mom was now crying. "Don't be upset, Karen. We'll work it out," replied Mr. Davies. "Mr. Kerr, the manager, is coming over this evening. I am sure he will try to help us. He was the one who agreed to the mortgage on the farm in the first place, so he's bound to want to help. But he's the man who wrote this letter. He's the one who is bringing the whole matter to a head. John, you will have to come up with something else," Mrs. Davies insisted, her voice trembling. "We'll see tonight. I'll know more after I talk to Mr. Kerr. Don't worry, honey. Come on, the children will be down in a minute. Don't let them see that you're upset. We don't want to worry them," said Mr. Davies. David slowly went back upstairs. He didn't want to see his mom cry. His sisters were still in their rooms. He could hear Emma singing along to some song she liked, and Sarah was obviously drying her hair. The noise of the hairdryer competing with the music, David grabbed his backpack, making sure he had everything he needed. He had forgotten for the time being about the Scarecrow. The conversation downstairs was bothering him now. He knew his dad had borrowed a lot of money to buy the farm. He had explained that to all of them when he warned them that there would be no big vacations for a year or two, at least not until he could get the first couple of harvests in. Something must have happened. David looked out the window. He caught sight of the Scarecrow again. "Now we have two big problems," he thought. The day passed slowly at school. David found it impossible to concentrate. His teacher had yelled at him a few times for staring into space. David had considered telling his teacher, but he didn't know her well yet. He had wished he had been back at his old school. Mr. Carnes, his old teacher, would have listened to his story about the Scarecrow. He would have known what to do. David had seen Sarah at lunchtime. Her teacher had almost sent her home. Her face was so white, and she had been physically sick that morning. But Sarah wanted to spend as much time away from the farm as she could, away from the Scarecrow. David was relieved when the last bell rang. He had been preparing himself all day, trying to work out how to tell his dad about the Scarecrow. But now, there was this money business. It was going to be hard to get his dad's attention. David sat beside Sarah on the bus home, but they didn't say a word. Emma had gone straight to a friend's house to sleep over. The two of them stepped off the bus slowly, walked up the path to the farmhouse. David couldn't resist looking over the field. Sarah stared at the ground. She didn't lift her eyes until they entered the house. "Hi, kids. We're gonna have an early dinner tonight. Dad's got a visitor coming," Mrs. Davies announced as they entered the kitchen. "Go and do your homework right away. It'll be ready in about 45 minutes. David and Sarah went up to their rooms. David decided it would probably be better to talk to his dad after he met the bank manager. If Dad had understood what this morning's conversation between If David had understood what this morning's conversation between his parents was about, he was sure that his dad would be in no mood to listen to his son's crazy story. He was sure his dad would sort everything out and would be in a better mood later. Mr. Davies was in the room that he used as a study next to the living room. He kept all his paperwork there. There was a lot of paperwork required for running a farm. He sat at his desk, going through the numbers over and over again. He knew he was in real trouble this time. He had borrowed a lot of money to buy the farm, and he had agreed to specific payment terms. He had agreed to pay back large sums of the loan after each harvest. The first big payment was supposed to be due later that year. It was only early spring, and harvest time was months away. But for some inexplicable reason, the bank was insisting that the first payment be made now. There was no way that Mr. Davies could come up with the first payment now. He had put all his savings into the farm. He had tried other banks, but they had not been willing to lend him any money. He had tried to explain that it was only a few months, but it had been in vain. Mr. Davies had heard a rumor that there was some property developer interested in building on the land. He had even heard that somebody wanted to buy and build a golf course and country club. Mrs. Toms, the old woman who had sold him the farm, had mentioned something about it. Apparently, she had been offered a lot of money several times to sell out, but she wanted the property to remain a farm. Her husband had been a farmer all his life and loved working the land. He couldn't understand the bank's attitude. Why were they changing the arrangements of the loan? Surely Mr. Kerr would be reasonable. He was relying on it. They had just finished dinner when Mr. Kerr arrived. David remembered seeing him before, when his dad was buying the farm. He had seemed nice enough then. David even remembered him talking to him about baseball. Mr. Davies and Mr. Kerr disappeared into the living room. Mrs. Davies ran around preparing snacks and coffee. She was obviously anxious. David hadn't said anything to his sister about what he had heard his mom and dad talking about. He didn't see any point. Sarah was already upset enough. The two men seemed to be locked in the room forever. Occasionally, David could hear his dad's voice raised, but he couldn't make out what was being said. It didn't sound as if it was going well. David looked at the alarm clock in his room. Mr. Kerr had been there for almost 2 hours. Eventually, David heard the living room door open. He ran to the top of the stairs. "I'm sorry, Mr. Davies. That's the way it has to be." David heard a deep voice say that he recognized as Mr. Kerr's. "We've been over all this enough. I'm sorry, but I have to go. I've spent too much time on this already. Either get the money to the bank by the end of the day, Monday, or lose the farm. That's our decision," Mr. Kerr added sternly. "But I still don't understand. What caused you to change what we had agreed upon? If this has to do with the golf development, I'll take you all to court," Mr. Davies stated angrily. "I'm sorry, I have to go. Do what you want, but if we don't see you on Monday, repossession papers will be served first thing Tuesday morning," Mr. Kerr said as he went out the front door. David heard his dad slam the door shut. Chapter 8. All Wet. Mr. Kerr rushed from the house, protecting himself from the heavy rain with his briefcase. He jumped into his car, a brand new white BMW. David watched him from the bedroom window. David was reluctant to go anywhere near his dad right now. In the car, Mr. Kerr struggled to keep his face straight. As soon as he had driven out of the farm gates and onto the main road, a broad grin appeared on his face. He quickly dialed a number on his phone. A couple of rings, someone answered. It's done. A few more days and it's ours. This is the big one, Jim. We'll make a cool $1 million from this deal. Mr. Kerr spoke loudly, battling against the noise of the car. How did it go? No problems? Asked Jim Cullen, Mr. Kerr's business associate. No problem at all, Mr. Kerr replied. He's just a small-time farmer. I had to really sell it, of course, pretend that we tried to help him. Does he suspect anything? Mr. Cullen asked, sounding a little less composed than his partner. Well, he has heard about the development threatened to take us to court, but he'll never be able to prove anything. I've covered all our tracks, replied Mr. Kerr. I hope you have. I really hope you have. Mr. Cullen started sounding nervously. Don't worry, Jim. I've taken care of everything. Once we serve the papers on Tuesday, we can celebrate. Until then, business as usual. See you tomorrow. Bye. Mr. Kerr pressed the end call button on the phone. He looked in the rearview mirror and allowed himself another smile. You've made it now. You're in the big time, he thought as he looked at himself. Mr. Kerr had been manager of the local bank for 5 years. He had worked up from a clerk position to running the bank. He had always been ambitious. To most, Mr. Kerr's career would have been considered a success. Not to Mr. Kerr. He thought he deserved better. He had been really irked when he was passed over twice for a promotion at the bank's headquarters. He hated being stuck in a small rural town pandering, as he saw it, to farmers. Now, he was using his position at the bank to cheat a family out of their home and livelihood just to get what he wanted: money. He had already signed agreements with a major development company. His dream was going to be a reality. The road ahead was very dark, but the new car's powerful headlights were casting a wide, bright beam. Mr. Kerr lived on the other side of town, but the country roads were quiet, and it wouldn't take him long to cover a few extra miles. As the car approached a sharp bend, Mr. Kerr slowed down. He knew the road well. Just beyond the corner stood the old stone bridge spanning the river. As his car came around the bend, the headlight showed some obstruction, blocking the road. What now? Exclaimed Mr. Kerr impatiently under his breath. It was now raining very heavily, and the last thing he wanted was to get out in the rain and struggle with some fallen tree. He could see now that it was a tree blocking the road. It didn't occur to Mr. Kerr that it was very strange for a tree to end up covering a bridge with water on either side. Mr. Kerr stopped the car a few yards short of where the tree was and turned the engine off. He stared out of the windshield for a few minutes, shook his head, and then reached for the door handle. As he stepped out of the car, he immediately felt the rain pelting down on him. He cursed the weather and walked up to the tree and stood over it. There was no way, it seemed, that he was going to be able to move it. He put his foot on top of the tree, testing if it could be rolled away. It wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a loud noise came from behind him. Mr. Kerr immediately recognized the sound as his own car, high-pitched revving. Someone had gotten into his car, turned the car on, and was revving the engine. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" Mr. Kerr shouted angrily. Peering through the headlight's beam, he lifted his hand to his eyes, trying to block the glare to make out who was sitting behind the wheel of his car. The glare was strong. He could see nothing except what looked like a hat. He started to move toward the car, but as he did, the car started to move forward towards him. "Stop right there!" Mr. Kerr shouted, his anger rising. The car was closing in on him. It started to move more quickly. Mr. Kerr took a couple steps back. He tried again to make out who was on the other side of the windshield. He still couldn't see clearly, with the lights blinding him. The car kept coming. His anger quickly turned into fear, as he sensed he was in real danger. The fear was paralyzing him. Mr. Kerr made a move to his left, trying to get out of the car's path, but as he did, the car immediately turned and continued straight for him. Mr. Kerr looked around. The tree was behind him, and to his right now, its long branches blocking his way and impeding his retreat. To his left, the bridge wall. He edged backwards. The car kept coming. There was only one way to go. He had jumped onto the wall. The bridge wall was very narrow, only about 5 inches wide. Mr. Kerr put his hand on top of the wall and hopped up. He wobbled slightly, his arms flapping. His upper body leaned over and his eyes fixed on the water below. The heavy rain had turned the normally quiet river into a raging torrent. Mr. Kerr regained his balance and turned around. "This isn't funny anymore," he shouted, trying to inject some form of authority into his voice. "Get out of my car!" he screamed, as if in reply to Mr. Kerr's demand. The car stopped inches from the wall. The car door started to open. Slowly, the dark figure got out. Mr. Kerr narrowed his eyes, following the stranger's movement as he came around from behind the car door. Mr. Kerr stared hard as the effects of the glare from the headlights disappeared. The figure became clearer. "What the?" The horror in his voice was chilling. Mr. Kerr moved to step back, forgetting where he was. His feet struggled to retain their grip. It was too late. He couldn't stop himself. He was going over. As he fell, he managed to grab the wall with one hand, the skin tearing from his fingers as they tried to hold his full weight. His hand was slipping. He reached out with the other hand, trying to get another hold onto the wall. He couldn't make it. He looked at the rushing water below. "Help! Help me, please!" Mr. Kerr pleaded. The pain in his fingers were too strong. The weight, too much. He started to slip away. As his hand came away from the wall, he began his fall into the water. He caught a glimpse of a head leaning over the wall. It was a wooden head. The noise of the wind and the rain drowned out his screams. As he plunged into the rushing water, the Scarecrow turned away. Chapter 9. Do not stand in my way. The next morning, the Davies house was somber. Everyone could see that Mr. Davies was in a terrible mood. David had heard his mother crying for the most of the night. Even now her eyes were red and sore. David's were too. He had managed to sleep very little over the past 2 nights, and he still hadn't been able to talk to his dad. Mr. Davies had stormed out 5 minutes after Mr. Kerr had left and hadn't returned until everyone had gone to bed. Sarah and Emma had no idea what was going on, but David knew the family was in serious trouble. He had heard Mr. Kerr's ultimatum. His dad had to pay the bank by Monday, or they were going to lose the farm. David was glad it was Saturday. He couldn't have faced school again. He was a mess. He was tired, confused, worried, and scared. His dad was messing around in the barn, repairing the digger. It had suddenly broke down first thing that morning as he had started to clear the field in front, the field with the Scarecrow in it. David was waiting for his dad to come in. He had made up his mind that no matter what, he had to tell his dad about the Scarecrow. Even if his dad refused to accept what he was saying, at least he would get it off his chest. He felt so lonely and isolated. There was, of course, Sarah, but he needed his dad to know. As David waited, the phone rang. Sarah ran to answer it, expecting to hear her friend's voice. She was expecting a call, but when she answered, she was disappointed. "Mom, it's Officer Collins again," she shouted, trying to reach her mom upstairs. Mrs. Davies came down, the Morrison incident, long replayed by the worries of the family's financial problems. She took the receiver from Emma. "Hello, officer. How can I help you?" she asked. David moved into the hallway where his mother was talking on the phone. He watched as the shock appeared on her face. She put her hand over the receiver. "David, go and get your dad quickly," she ordered. David could see the anxiety in her eyes. He spun around and immediately ran to get his dad. The two returned quickly. Mrs. Davies was standing by the telephone. She was rooted to the spot since Officer Collins had hung up. Mr. Davies rushed to his wife, anticipating that her legs were about to give out on her any second. He ushered her into the living room. Mrs. Davies spoke first. "He was sitting on that chair a few hours ago. What is it? What happened now?" asked Mr. Davies, confused and worried. Mrs. Collins relayed the brief conversation with Officer Collins. She explained that they had found Mr. Kerr's car in the river this morning. He is missing, but they are out searching for him. The river was so high last night, he must have been swept up in it. They're looking downstream for him now. But how on earth? "Where did this happen?" interrupted Mr. Davies. "Next to the old bridge, on the way to town. They can't understand what happened to him. They couldn't find evidence of the car losing control on the road. It looks like it just calmly drove up into the river, Mrs. Davies replied, her eyes filling up. Oh, John, what's going on? First that man the other night, and now this? What's going on? Mrs. Davies pleaded, beginning to break down. Mr. Davies held his wife in his arms, trying to comfort her. His mind drifted to the meeting he had with Mr. Kerr the night before. David had listened to his mom relaying the news about Mr. Kerr. It didn't take him long enough to add the Mr. Kerr incident to all the others. Mr. Kerr was threatening the farm. David had also heard the rumors about the golf course development. Most of the town seemed to know that Mr. Kerr had wanted their farm for some time. Last night, it had looked as if he was about to get his way with the Monday deadline. David didn't buy the police officer's story. Something or somebody was to blame. David knew it had to be the Scarecrow. David waited for his father to come out of the living room. Dad, I have to talk to you, David started. Is it important, son? I need to see your mom. She's really upset. Dad, before I tell you anything, I need you to come outside with me. I need you to look at the Scarecrow with me. Dad continued. Look, son. Enough with this nonsense, Mr. Davies snapped. Dad, just do it, okay? David insisted, raising his voice. Mr. Davies was taken back by his son's tone. He recognized that there was something upsetting David. He put his arm around his son. Come on, let's go. The two crossed the yard in silence, climbed the fence. David approached the wooden figure nervously. Mr. Davies could see that his son was really bothered by the Scarecrow. David lifted the hat from the Scarecrow's head. Mr. Davies had a good 18 inches taller than his son and could easily see the words written on the bald head. This land is yours for you to scare all beings who perchance to dare to disturb or threaten without pity this house's peace and prosperity. The farmer looked at his son and then read the words again, as if to make sure he understood their meaning. I have no idea what to think. Let's go back. They walked slowly back toward the house. On the way, David rapidly ran through all the events on the past few days, connecting everything back to the Scarecrow and the eerie words on the Scarecrow's head. In every case, the person or animal affected by the Scarecrow or affected by the farm had in some way threatened or disturbed it. David told his dad about witnessing the Scarecrow disappear and then reappear when they reached the kitchen door. Mr. Davies looked back. The Scarecrow looked so normal, like all scarecrows he had seen in all the years he had been working as a farmer. As they entered the kitchen, Mr. Davies took his son's arm. Listen, son, don't say a word to this to anyone, especially not your mother. She is at her wits' end at the moment. I have to think about this for a while. I don't want to make us the laughing stock of the whole town. He paused, his mind struggling to accept what seemed inconceivable. But he was beginning to share his son's anxiousness. At least, he thought. If there was something going on, it didn't seem to be posing a threat to his family. If it was the Scarecrow, it seemed to be trying to protect them. I have to go into town, go to the bank to see how things stand for Monday, said Mr. Davies. I don't know how this business with Mr. Kerr is going to affect things. When I come back, we'll light a fire and burn the thing. And then, let's see what happens. Mr. Davies left 10 minutes later. The bank was usually closed on Saturdays, but Mr. Davies had managed to get someone on the phone. David was worried. He had felt better telling his dad, and he was happy to see that his dad seemed to share his concerns. However, he wished that they had dealt with the Scarecrow before he had left for town. The hours passed slowly. David remained in his room until late afternoon. His dad had still not come back. Eventually, he pulled back his curtain to look at the wooden man. David stepped back. The fear returned in a flash. The Scarecrow was gone. He ran downstairs and scanned the yard from the kitchen door. Did Dad come back and take the horrible thing away to burn it? He thought more in hope than anything. He ran out to see if he could see his dad's car or his dad himself. There was no sign. He heard a noise from the barn. He hesitated and then walked toward the entrance. Suddenly, from inside, he heard a voice. "Looking for me, David?" David froze. It was not his dad's voice. It was not any voice he recognized. He could sense the presence in the barn before he could see it. He entered the barn, his legs like jelly, the fear taking over his body. "Hello, David." The wooden Scarecrow stepped from behind some bales of hay, moving in a slow, deliberate manner. David stood motionless, unable to speak. All his fears were now a reality. Morrison had not been a madman. As far as he could tell, this thing in front of him was really dangerous. The Scarecrow's strained, lightly high-pitched voice continued. "David, do not stand in my way. I was made for this. I am doing what I must do." David struggled to speak. His throat and lips were dry. Eventually he blurted out, "But why? I serve the farm. David, I was made to protect it. People are not important. People come and go. But the land remains forever. I serve the land, the farm, and the land." The significance of the Scarecrow's words hit David. The Scarecrow wasn't protecting them. It was only interested in the farm and the land. Anything that threatened the land was in danger. "Do not stand in my way, David. Do not try to stop me. Heed my words." The Scarecrow hissed. He moved toward David. David closed his eyes, paralyzed by fear. He felt the Scarecrow walk by him, and then felt the Scarecrow's presence disappear. David opened his eyes. He was alone. He fell to the floor, his legs finally giving out. And that is the end of chapter 9, my dear friends. Tune in next chapter, chapter 10, Fire. This has been Ruby, signing off.